I don't have to tell you that devices these days play a central role in our lives. Kids get them on average when they're 12 or 13, at least in this country, and forever after that device is with them. They consult it hundreds of times a day, etc., and don't want to leave home without it or even sleep with it. But devices negatively affect our physical, mental, and social well-being. We will have about 2.5 billion phones on Earth in use this year, meaning almost a third of the population. And it's pretty scary, actually, that we are doing this experiment without realizing what the impact and what the is on people's well-being, basically. So only recently, in the last couple of years, people have started studying the effects of cell phone use on all sorts of things. And unfortunately, the news is not very good. So we're sort of, the researchers are catching up, but it's basically too late because 2.5 billion people are addicted and glued to these devices already. There's studies showing, for example, the effect on posture and back and neck problems with extended phone use, the impact on respiration. It reduces your lung volume and your ability to breathe if you use your phone a lot. There's lots of studies about the effects of sleep. 50% of phone users use their phone at least once in the middle of the night. Can you imagine? And there's all these research studies now that are showing that if you use your phone before you go to sleep, as well as sort of the amount of time that you spend on your phone each day negatively correlates with quality and duration of sleep. And quality and duration of sleep are basically risk factors, or poor quality and duration of sleep are risk factors for heart disease, for diabetes, for mood and depression disorders, and more. Studies are showing the other effects on mental well-being, for example, anxiety. This is a study that was done in Britain about young people, showing that number of hours spent on a phone basically is directly correlated or inversely correlated with mental health, and is correlated with anxiety, increased anxiety. People like Betsy Sparrow at Columbia University are doing studies on the effect that these systems have on our memory. And she has shown that when people, for example, read an article on a computer or a cell phone versus on paper, they actually, without realizing it, read completely differently, and they don't internalize what they are reading. They read it much quicker and just try to get a sense of what's in the article, as opposed to really trying to let it sink in what they are reading about. So they just pick up meta information about the article because they realize they can later go back to the article if they want to look up some details. People who use the internet to solve a problem are then increasingly actually tend to then use the internet in the future to solve problems. So for example, instead of being creative or really using your brain to solve a problem or come up with an idea, we much more quickly Google something. So if I tell someone, well, think of a hat, describe a hat to me, people, instead of using their own mind to come up with an original idea for a hat, may actually Google images for a hat. And the more they do that, the more likely they are to keep doing that. So it really affects our creativity as well. Effects on social interactions. It used to be the case that if you had a problem, you would actually go talk to a friend or call a family member to figure out how to, whatever, make spaghetti bolognese or whatever it is. But now, of course, we consult the internet, so it affects our social relationships as well. Thank you. And face-to-face interaction. So people have done studies showing that if you get together for coffee or whatever with a colleague and you have your phones there, it negatively affects the face-to-face interactions, even if you don't even consult a phone. Effects on attention and task performance. Just having a phone upside down on your desk or workspace somewhere negatively affects how, yeah, I see it right there, Michael. you're probably paying less attention to what I'm saying just because your phone is within your visual field. So even without using it, without the phone ever buzzing, people do less well on tasks when there is a phone somewhere present in their visual field. It's really scary, basically. So I would argue that even though these devices are sort of sold to us as increasing our ability to be successful and learn and perform better, etc., it's true, they put the world's information at our fingertips, but they actually have a detrimental effect on things like attention, grit, memory, emotional regulation, self-confidence, creativity, and so on. And if you read about what sort of the important things are that kids, young kids and young adults and so on should learn, the qualities that they should develop to do well in the 21st century, it is exactly these types of things, the things that actually phones make us less good at. So one reason that this is the case, of course, is the current form factor. And Albrecht Schmidt came up with this analogy. He says basically that today's smartphone is like a monocle. We've moved away from monocles because if you use a monocle to be able to see something better, first of all, you have to remember which pocket you put it in, and you have to get it out, put it in, and so on before you can use it. They probably weren't personalized to a person's specific eyesight problems and so on. Well, today's smartphones are like that. Just using it at all, even for a simple task, is an entire disruption of what it is that you're doing because you have to find where it is and unlock it and start an app and so on. So it's a complete disruption of your attention. And so we are trying to, I think what we need is something that is a little bit more like contact lenses, something that is sort of less, that still helps you in some way, but is less disruptive and really sort of can change your perception of reality without you having to think about using it. So we call this area cognitive augmentation, and in my lab at MIT, we try to think of both the form factors as well as sort of the style in which you would use personal devices that are always with you, but that are less of a distraction, that are really sort of an augmentation. And just like lenses make you see better, they help you sort of with all sorts of cognitive tasks without you almost being aware of it. So these cognitive augmentation systems, in contrast with today's interfaces, are always on. You don't turn them on or off, they're always on. And they're always aware of the user's context and state. As you know, that we have a lot more sensors available these days, and so computers, and we can make sense of all this sensor data. So computers can be made much more aware of what it is that we're doing, the fact that you're right now listening to a talk, for example, that there's many people around you and so on, that you are paying attention or maybe not paying attention and so on. Computers have the ability to know all of that and take that into account in how they help us. the systems we built, they, instead of sort of being a separate device that you use to consult something or to look up some information, they actually are more a system that mediates your experience of reality and changes your experience of reality. And they do that using multiple modalities, not just vision, not just audio, but even things like scent and so on, and often conscious as well as subconscious stimuli. Today's interfaces, computers and smartphones, only use outputs that require that we pay deliberate attention to them, that we consciously pay attention to them. And there's a huge opportunity for devices to actually influence our thinking and influence our behavior in ways that we are not even aware of, with stimuli that we notice but that don't sort of distract us or that we don't consciously think of. So I think that the time is right for sort of these cognitive augmentation systems to be built. For one, because a first enabler is sort of there. We have lots of different systems now for sensory augmentation, for changing a person's perception of the world around them. Of course, visual augmented reality is sort of really becoming available with things like Magic Leap and the Vuzix Blade and also HoloLens and so on, and they're gradually getting better and better. But there's also interesting systems in the audio space. For example, Bose has this great product that takes real-time audio and can totally transform it so that you hear better, or you hear sort of noise and sound from a particular direction, and all the sound coming from other directions is sort of, the volume of that is turned down. So they, in real time, basically change the audio so that the audio can be tuned to whatever it is that you want to pay attention to. There's other types of interfaces that can change your perception of scent, the reality of scent, and I'll talk about those in a minute. A second enabler that is making these cognitive augmentation systems possible is sensing and perception. We now have things like Google Clips or other types of cameras that basically constantly can be looking at your environment, and then with algorithms like YOLO and so on, be interpreting what it is that is in front of you and around you, and even which people you're interacting with, etc. There's systems that can sort of sense the internal state of the user with, for example, the Empatica, a bracelet that gives you heart rate and electrodermal activity, which is sort of a measure of your excitement level, positive and negative. There's things like the Muse, which now comes in a very simple glasses form factor. This system can tell you whether you're focused or not at any point in time, and other data. And all of this data can be interpreted to basically make sense of the user's current state and then decide how a system can help the user. The third enabler is, of course, artificial intelligence. We now have good enough algorithms, mostly sort of the neural net variety, to make sense of all this data about the user and the user's context, and to decide how to affect the user in real time in a particular way. So I'll give you some examples in a minute of how these cognitive augmentation types of devices will completely change the way people make decisions, the way people learn, the way we memorize things, the way we regulate our emotions and deal with our sort of well-being and so on. So take decision making. a couple of years ago, we did this system that illustrates this vision of sort of integrating or changing a person's perception of reality and really integrating the digital world, relevant information about the digital world with a person's physical surroundings. And instead of with a heads-up augmented reality display, we used a projected display, a projected system that can pay attention to anything that you are doing with your hands or that is in front of you and can augment it with relevant information. So the digital and the physical world become merged. You see the Amazon rating of a book when you pick up that book and the reviews that that book got when you open it up, etc. So you don't have to do anything special, like get your phone out to look up the Amazon rating of a book that you see lying around that seems interesting. All of that sort of automatically is provided by the system based on the fact that
in 1943, Churchill gave a famous talk at Harvard University.
That you are currently picking up that book. So you don't have to do anything. Everything just happens proactively. Learning, so this will affect decision-making, of course, when we can see all this information about the things around us projected onto things that we interact with. It will also change learning, and I want to dive a little bit deeper into some of the experiments that we're doing there. We're using the HoloLens and other mixed reality platforms to change the way people learn a second language. So this system, WordSense, is built by one of my students. It's basically a application on the HoloLens that recognizes any object around you, desk,
please give me a cup of milk,
etc. And when it recognizes an object, you can look up all these definitions, or you get the word, you hear how the word is pronounced. Sorry, you can turn it down a little bit. You can hear how the word is pronounced, etc. You can even get movies, famous movie clips where that particular object was used. To get an example of how that word is used in a sentence. It's a little bit hard to see with the lights.
I think I'll have one.
But so this can be done for anything around you that the system can recognize, basically any object around you. You can see examples of how that particular word is used. Maybe people recognize that one. And of course, one fun sort of thing is that it's a lot more engaging. You don't have to like look at a video or read a book or something to learn English, say, as a second language. You can just go about your day and learn about the words for objects and how you pronounce it and some example uses and so on. We've even gone a little bit further. Our hypothesis is that if you learn in this very situated way, that basically you remember the words a lot better than if you just sort of are learning from a book or a video. And Christian just recently did some tests where his hypothesis was that if you use your whole body while you are learning words related sort of to certain gestures, that basically you would remember those words in that second language that you're learning better. So he built a whole system that recognizes what gesture you're performing in a virtual world, and it tells you the word, and you hear it as well. So every time you go like this, you hear stab, 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 swing, and he did basically ran drink, pour, and so on, because this is the way kids learn a language. I mean, you're engaged in the action, and your parent or caregiver tells you sort of what things are called. So he showed that people who learn using this sort of kinesthetic VR method basically lose less words. So if you test them right after they've studied, they actually perform about the same. Right after they've basically studied all the words in either the control or in the kinesthetic learning or in a VR control where you don't actually engage in the activity yourself, but you're in the exactly same sort of setup. So people who learned actually in the kinesthetic, the number of words that they lose after a week is much smaller than the people in the control, both of the control groups. And we have a nice correlation that shows that the more times you engage in an action and hear the words, the better you remember that word 2 weeks later, and the less likely that you forget that word. So showing that learning in this full body way, not just learning with your head, but learning with your whole body involved is actually much more effective than otherwise. Mina Kahn is another student who's doing the same type of thing for math. So she has a whole system called MathLand using the HoloLens that basically tells you or teaches you about physics concepts in your real world. So you can bounce a virtual ball off of the walls around you and the objects around you and see what the speed and acceleration and all of that is at different points in time. You can change gravity and say like, well, what if I were on the moon? How would that ball bounce on the moon, and see all of that visualized? She recently built a multi-user version of that system so that multiple HoloLens users can basically have these sort of puzzles, math and physics puzzles that they together solve. They can create force fields and use all sorts of things to make these Rube Goldberg-like machines and create puzzles for one another or try to solve a puzzle that somebody created using this mixed reality type of setup. And the name, by the way, of the system, MathLand, is inspired by Seymour Papert, who said, well, if you grow up in France, you just naturally learn French. It's very easy. Why don't we have something like MathLand? Wouldn't it be great if we had a MathLand that you could go to where you just live there and you learn math, just like you learn French in France, growing up in France. So the whole goal with her system is to basically try to create this kind of MathLand system. Note that it doesn't always have to be an AI system that sort of augments your perception of reality. In this system, and maybe I'll restart it, basically a remote user augments the visual field of a person who needs help, in this case with the laser cutter. So the remote expert can actually make her hands available in real time in the visual field of the person who needs help, showing him how to use this laser cutter, which button to push or what knob to turn, how wide to open something and so on. And we tested, and the paper is at Chi, and showed that people basically are able to solve things remotely a lot better when they have this augmented view where they can share their gestures with one another in real time. We do a lot of VR learning work as well, sort of this immersive VR work, VR learning work. And specifically, we're working with Professor John Belcher of the physics department at MIT, who teaches the undergraduate required physics class. It's required for all MIT undergrads, and one of the things they learn about is electrostatics. So we made a whole VR world where they can create charges and fields and sort of see what happens. Maybe some of you were there as undergrads and still remember that class. But basically, we did tests with MIT undergrads and showed that the ones who train using this immersive system, again, full body sort of all around, the physics simulation is all around you, the ones that train in the immersive system do a lot better on the tests, the actual tests that we have in this course, 802. Isn't the number of the course. So they do a lot better than the ones that trained on a 2D screen using the exact same simulation. So everything was kept the same. We have the people who train in VR and then the people who train on a flat screen, but it's still a 3D experiment, basically, or a 3D simulation. And the ones that experienced this in VR did better on the tests. Memory is another thing that using these types of augmented cognition systems will be totally transformed. And I want to highlight one system that we built that I think is very interesting. Nevermind is a system that uses the principle of the memory palace to help a person learn something. The memory palace is this really fascinating technique that ancient Romans and Greeks already had invented to try to memorize long speeches and other information. And it basically consists of you sort of make a virtual palace, or it can be a whole path somewhere in your mind, and attach the information that you have to remember to sort of a path in this palace or a path in this virtual space that you've created. And we actually make it easier with our system for people to use this technique by making use of augmented reality. So we did an experiment where people had to learn the Super Bowl winners, the consecutive Super Bowl winners, basically a very random set of facts with not much logic to them. And we give them these Moverio augmented reality glasses, and they show the subsequent winners of the Super Bowl superimposed on their experience of reality when they follow a path that they know very well, that they're very familiar with. Specifically, in our case, going from the subway in Kendall Square in Cambridge to the Media Lab building and their office in the Media Lab. And the system basically shows you the Panthers and the Jets and this and that in sequence as you are going about, going from the T to your office. And it turns out, so this is what that looks like basically for the first 10 winners. You come out of the subway station and you see someone with a lot of boxes for the Packers going up the escalator, and then you see again another guy with a lot of boxes, and then you come out of the subway and you see a jet parked right there. When you come out of the subway, you go to the medical building and there's an Indian for the Indians sitting on the stairs. You go through the medical building. Some of you will know this path and know what I mean. But and you see two guys fighting for the Colts. And then you see a cowboy at the stairs to the Media Lab, etc. And just experiencing this once, you basically remember the set of Super Bowl winners for the rest of your life. It's really bizarre. I can still do it. So most people just never forget, because you tie this factual information to an episodic type of memory, and your episodic memory is very good, but your factual memory is actually much weaker. So we had people in a paper-based task and then in the augmented reality task. And this shows you that right after people studied the winners of the Super Bowl on paper or in this augmented reality system, they perform the same. But already like 24 hours later, basically, well, they haven't forgotten that, the paper ones have already forgotten more than 50%. And then 7 days later, they've forgotten even more, while the people that used the augmented reality system they don't forget any of the information that they have learned, basically. So it really shows how having this much more sort of immersive interface where your interface to the digital world is more like real life, like is basically highly effective for things like memory and learning, and much more effective than other interfaces, paper, flat screens, and so on that we've used so far. We work a lot on improving mood and well-being as well. One system, for example, that we've been working on for several years now is a system that uses scent. Our experience of reality obviously is not just visual and auditory for people. We have 5 senses, maybe 6 if you include interoception. And scent is actually an overlooked modality for interfaces. Not much interesting work has been done. But if you look at the literature on scent in psychology, there's so much fascinating information, and there's so much that we HCI researchers could be doing to make use of scent in interfaces. For example, if you are studying, say, another language or something else, and you present a certain scent while you're studying, and then you present that same scent again when you are taking a test, say, a couple days later, you actually do better on the test, because this scent, having this extra element of scent, helps you cue your memory and helps you recall information. And if you actually present that same scent during sleep, you do even better. So you can actually present a scent during sleep, and it makes the person better on the test the next day, because they have in their mind associated, say, vanilla or lavender or whatever with learning that particular, say, set of words in another language. Scent can also be used to influence mood, to influence perception of pain, to influence attention, and more. So Judith in my group has been building scent interfaces like this one, which it takes into account, or it can look at EEG data about how focused you are, as well as electrodermal activity, heart rate, temperature, all sorts of things. And the system basically uses, or via Bluetooth, interacts with the phone, and the phone can control when the scent has to be produced. So it can be tied, for example, to different sleep stages, so that it can present a certain scent at the time that sleep researchers think consolidation of memory into long-term memory happens. You can use it while studying, etc. She now has a version with multiple containers for multiple situations, so that if you're behind the wheel and you're a little too sleepy, the system can give you peppermint or citrus. Or if you are a little bit anxious because you're meeting with your advisor, it can give you a scent that calms you down, and so on. So it knows what your emotional state is and can try to influence your state based or using scent. Judith also built another system that gives you more insight into what it means to be mindful, and that teaches you to be mindful. So this system as well uses the Muse EEG system, and combines that with virtual reality and a leap motion detector as well, so that you have superpowers in virtual reality when you're focused. like you can levitate. But then as soon as you think, what's for dinner, or what's this problem set I have to deal with, you basically lose your superpowers. So you learn what it feels like to be focused, and you become better at being focused, given this feedback, basically, by the system. One of my newer students, I've been accepting a few students that have a neuroscience background, and one of them, Adam Horowitz, has been systems for interfacing during sleep. Again, this is sort of another area that HCI hasn't really dealt with. We only create interfaces for awake conditions, and we even only create interfaces for conscious use, that people consciously use, where they have to put their complete attention on the system. There's just a lot that could be done creating systems that we can use without paying attention to them, or that affect us without us paying attention to them. And this particular system that Adam built actually interfaces during certain sleep stages. We started by building a system that uses EEG as well as other data, temperature, heartbeat, EDA, to do sleep staging, to understand what stage of sleep a person is in. And there's a particularly interesting sleep stage between stage 1 and stage 2. It's called hypnagogia. And it's sort of just when you're about to completely fall asleep, you're already sort of in a very drowsy state, but you're not completely asleep yet. And that is a very interesting stage, sort of, where you can basically do lucid dreaming. And it's not a totally crazy type of thing. In fact, a lot of artists and scientists, including Feynman, Einstein, Dali, they all used lucid dreaming to be creative, to help them be creative. They did it by basically taking a nap with some heavy objects in your hand. And this stage of sleep basically coincides with atonia, with when you lose muscle tone. So as soon as they would enter this stage, the same metal ball that they were holding or something else would drop to the floor, and that would wake them up. And then they would force themselves to think about a particular problem that they wanted to work on. So this system actually makes that easier. So it detects when you are entering, when you're going from sleep 1 stage to sleep 2. And then we use, at the moment, a conversational robot. We also have a version that just works on a phone, actually. But here it's shown with Jibo. So as soon as you reach that state, Jibo tells you to think about a particular topic that you told it earlier you want to be creative around. So you can tell it, I want to think about this or that problem. And as soon as you enter that stage, it tells you to think about that, and then talks to you and records what you say. And we actually tested this. It's admittedly, we only have 8 people so far that we collected data for, but all of the ones that were able to fall asleep, 2 of them were too wired to be able to fall asleep. But they basically were able to use the system, and they dreamt about what we wanted them to dream about. So we gave them a word. We had 2 words that are both very sort of neutral. We had rabbit and fork. And so Jibo would tell them, think about a rabbit or think about a fork. And these are some of the quotes of our subjects, and I'll show you some quantitative data as well. But basically, people sort of report how basically their executive functioning, their logical self gets out of the way, and they can think more broadly sort of about the topic in more crazy ways, basically. because that stage of sleep, I mean, your executive part of your brain is basically the first part that sort of turns off when you fall asleep. And so you can still kind of think about a problem, but it doesn't make that much logical sense. But that exactly is what makes it possible to come up with more crazy ideas. So we had a control group and then a study group. The control group would just lie down with their eyes closed and not fall asleep, basically, but think about fork or rabbit. And then we had our condition group. They did basically fall asleep, and the system then talked with them about fork or rabbit. When we woke people up, we had them perform an alternative uses task, which is sort of a standard task that people use to measure creativity. And we also had them basically dictate a story about rabbit or fork, and we then looked at what they came up with in terms of stories and also what alternative uses they came up with. And the people in the experimental condition basically showed more creativity or better creativity than the control group. So these are just some examples of some of the projects that we're working on, but all of them sort of fall in this category of going beyond the interfaces that we use today, the smartphones primarily that we use today that are incredibly disruptive, to systems that really just change your perception of reality and include information in your perception of reality or alter your perception of reality. These systems basically make use of implicit as well as explicit stimuli. Again, this implicit stimuli is an area that I think is very much underexplored in HCI. There's been work by Hiroshi Ishii on ambient interfaces and some work on COM technology and so on. But I think there's a lot more opportunity for HCI systems to use stimuli that affect a person's cognition, their attitudes and their behavior, without the person even being aware that it's happening. The systems that we built make use of these implicit stimuli. They also make use of implicit inputs, information that can be sensed about the user without the user having to enter information about what it is they're interested in or whether they're even interested and focused on anything right now or not, and so on. I think that this new this idea of augmentation can really rescue our relationship with smartphones. If a device is always on, just in subtle ways changing your reality, it means that the use is less disruptive because you don't have to consciously sort of switch to use the device. By integrating sort of the information in your perception of your environment, we avoid attention shifts. Implicit interaction using multiple modalities also reduces the demand for conscious processing of inputs. Right now, everything your cell phone tells you, whether it's via voice or on the screen, you have to consciously sort of process it and pay attention to it. But there's opportunities for just modifying a person's reality without them needing to be aware of it. And embodied interfaces that present information like that in this very natural way, just the way real reality presents itself, seem to be a lot more effective for learning and for helping people with memorization. Of course, we should be mindful of possible dangers, invasion of privacy, once these systems sort of record continuously everything happening around us and inside of us. That could be a huge potential invasion of privacy if that information is not kept private. Lack of user understanding. If a system changes your reality, you should be aware of the ways in which it's doing that, because otherwise, of course, there can be problems like that you become blind to real reality, or that you live in a bubble world where you think everything is beautiful because the system has maybe edited out all the ugly parts of reality around you. These types of systems should very much be under the control of the user. The user should deliberately choose how a system will impact their perception and their behavior. And last, we think a lot about dependency. We don't want people to become too dependent on sort of a device that helps them with things. So we often try to design solutions where the system itself makes itself obsolete after a while. And it may help you with maybe forming a good behavior or learning something, but then eventually you don't need the system anymore because your behavior, your habits have changed, or you have learned what it is that you wanted to learn. So that's it. Thank you. That's what we work on. Yeah, we have, yep, you have a question. Time? Yes. Yeah.
The long-term sustainability about like these various like memory augmenting things, like I suspect that there's like a big novelty / motivation component in these things, right? Like your premise was like you live in France, then you'll learn French, but like if you look at like, for example, Hong Kong, you'll find that lots of people have been living there for decades and don't know a word of Cantonese, right? So
yeah.
yes. So like I wonder like do you think like is like a person just going to like grow, like is it going to continue to work even after the novelty of the technology is worn off?
We don't necessarily know, but again, like I mentioned at the end, I think a lot of this we envision people using for a while, but then not needing to use it anymore. So maybe while you are learning something, you use sort of the augmentation that shows you the math everywhere around you, or the Newtonian physics everywhere around you. But then if you then feel like this, you know these concepts well enough, you can turn that off, and it doesn't have to keep overwhelming your sort of experience of reality. Yeah. Yes.
So in clinical psychology and public health and social worker, they try to come with these interventions that may actually work on a larger scale, right? Because there's millions of people who might not have access to a lot of technology. And there's challenges in adoption and engagement and like long-term success. That's the same. What's your view of like, how can we like really massify this? Should we think about like, transforming things that people already use every day, like a chair or a desk or something, to make it into a system that might actually support people as opposed to use that?
I mean, definitely you can sort of augment a person's perception of reality, or you can change reality itself. But I think that typically the former is a cheaper approach, actually. There is a lot of work, of course, on sort of putting sensors and things in the physical objects around us to help us with understanding certain phenomena or learning certain phenomena. But I personally think that those technologies are much more expensive to make accessible at a wide scale than what I'm talking about here. Because basically 2.5 billion people have phones, and I think that this is where phones are going, basically. So in another 10 or 15 years, everybody will have heads-up displays and with multiple sensors, etc., and that will be what they use for all their information needs and communication needs as well. So I think that this is in terms of strategy for wide adoption and wide scaling, that this is a better approach than trying to create physical, tangible, smart things. Yeah. Yes.
So you talked a lot about how to create these technologies that are more liminal and that disrupt us less while providing us with the same benefits. I think what you didn't touch on and what I was hoping to ask about is sort of how or why these are the technologies that people want to use. In a sense, I think that we often invite distraction upon ourselves. That if I have a device that can receive messages from my friends, that's what I'm going to want to do, right?
Yeah.
And maybe the reason why I'm less distracted when I'm reading a book is I can't. So in creating all these technologies that are sort of even closer to our fingertips, that are on our body, that are always with us, is there a worry that we are just, we're going to circumvent the whole, pervasive ambient and really just dive into the same types of distractions that we've come to know and love, which is a richer access to information?
It's possible. Yes. Maybe all of the systems we built, we're trying to make them very minimal, sort of, and they're minimal interventions in your reality, but we don't know how these will be rolled out or what people ultimately will choose to do with them, and it's possible that they use them for maximum distraction capability rather than sort of really helping them with their presence, with their awareness of the here and the now, and with whatever it is that they're currently trying to get better at or trying to accomplish. Yeah.
Whether your lab has looked into using cognitive augmentation systems for certain disorders or disabilities. I'm thinking specifically about autism spectrum disorder and kind of the emotion recognition that they can learn a lot from, I think, with the immersive kind of technology.
Yeah, we haven't actually worked on autism specifically. Maybe the closest that we are to dealing with a particular condition sort of is that several of my students are working with Alzheimer's patients and trying to do memory augmentation for not of the variety that I showed here with the memory palace, but just helping a person with like remembering who is the person that is coming toward them, what did they talk about last time they had a conversation, and so on. So those people really need help sort of augmenting their memory so that they can still sort of be social and not socially awkward and can maintain their relationships and remain engaged in their social life. So we are using it in that context, but I didn't include that work here yet. Yeah. Yes.
What do you think of smartwatches? Have they lived up to their ability or the hype to augment us, or are they just another distraction, a phone for your phone?
I think it's just a smaller screen on your wrist, so I'm not at all excited about smart watches other than for the sensing that they can do, that they can integrate basically because they are in touch with the body. But so yeah, we're not using them at all. Because you still have to shift your attention. I mean, it's a little bit faster than trying to dig through my bag here to find my phone, but it's still a complete distraction. And just the fact that it's so small makes it so that you can you even have to pay more attention, it seems, or attention for longer, because not as many bits can be shown necessarily on a tiny display than can be when you're augmenting your entire experience of reality, sort of. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I'll go to you next. Yeah.
Given what you just said about augmenting the reality, and you use so much VR and AR in your work, what do you think of future control for those devices?
Yeah, unfortunately, the current systems, the area where they're really deficient is in interaction, basically. So for a lot of these systems, we've had to create our own input mechanisms, gestural and others, tracking systems, and so on, because they're not at all focused on input. It's all about the visual output. Yeah.
Effective input those?
Well, I think gestures are definitely very interesting, and I think not necessarily special gestures that the person needs to learn, but there's so many gestures that you perform that can give a system information about your intentions. Like if I pick up a book, that means I'm interested in it. If I pick up a book the 5th time, the system should know like what page I was at last time around, etc. So I think really doing perception of the user's actions that are not intended as special actions for the machine, but just their daily life actions, that we should go to, we should use that as an input mechanism. Also gaze and things like that, yeah. Yes, yeah. Yes.
So the examples you showed had to be placed on different areas of the body depending on how it was interacting with the user or what kind of sensors it needed. I was wondering how you envisioned a complete augmentation system to look like, whether it's like one system or like one item that you can use, or it involves multiple items.
Yeah, right now we're doing many one-off experiments and systems, although right now we're trying to make a platform that could be used for multiple experiments, memory, decision-making, learning, etc. We're choosing to go with auditory augmented reality, just because that can be done in a more acceptable form factor. We started doing all this work with the HoloLens, and of course, you're not going to walk around with the HoloLens in a social context. But you could imagine walking around with bone conduction headphones that just at the right moment, based on your context and so on, and information they can gather about what you're doing and what your intentions are, can give you relevant information in auditory way. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, I'm just wondering, how did you measure like cognitive augmentation being less disruptive? Because for the first example where you retrieve information relevant from Amazon, like that interaction with the projected interface seems even more effortful and disruptive to me. So how did you really measure?
Yeah. Well, the way I'm imagining, we didn't necessarily test. I mean, this is really, I believe that it will make things less disruptive, but we actually haven't tested disruption. That would be very interesting to do, though, to see like, is there less degradation of performance on some task with these kinds of interfaces. So we haven't done that. That's more sort of the motivation or the hypothesis that we believe will be the case. Yeah. Yes.
Final question.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I wanted to ask about, you mentioned this briefly at the end, the use of the information that's collected by all these devices and the way that information is presented to people, especially when it's in a very personalized context. And especially now, as you mentioned, I think there's a lot of concern that when you have devices providing these kind of personalized recommendations, especially if it's in this sense where you almost don't realize or it's happening very subconsciously, there can be a lot of biases that happen with that. I'm thinking of the example of where someone took a book off the shelf and they saw recommendations for it. And depending on the biases in those recommendations, I mean, it could affect what people study or don't study, read or don't read. So I'm just curious, how do you think about that problem when you're designing new augmented reality devices? And I mean, what do you think needs to be done in that space before these kinds of devices can become ubiquitous in order to ensure that?
So I think that the problem isn't any different from what is already happening today. Everything you do online, and even to some extent offline, is already being collected and is taken into account in your social media feeds and the ads that you see and all of that. All that information is already being collected. So we're collecting similar but even more information, but I don't think that the problem is already there. And I think already people aren't very aware of what is going on. So I think this problem is much bigger, that people should be more aware of what information is collected about them, what the system assumes about them. They should be able to edit that and remove parts of it and decide who has access to it, etc. So that's a much bigger problem that already very much affects all the systems that we use today, I think. Yeah.
Both the systems you're talking about and the existing systems.
Yes.
In ensuring that the kind of information that's presented to people is more unbiased and doesn't create a bubble, and if so, do you have any ideas about how that's even possible while maintaining like personalization?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's a big question, but I think there are ways of doing that you can, for example, show people their personal recommendations, but still show them how that is very different from everybody else around them, or how that situates them with respect to other people. And there's a lot of good work like that that is happening, for example, at the Media Lab with Ethan Zuckerman, or also Deb Roy is doing a lot of sort of visualizing of other groups that you don't belong to, and how do they see the world, and how is your view of the world different from others or the same as others, and so on. So I think people, I'm not against personalization, but you should be aware that it's going on and aware that there's these very different views of reality that other people may see. Yeah.
Excellent. Let's take our speaker one more time.